Good morning, folks. So back here doing the rest of this talk, and you can unblank the. So basically, what I decided to use actually for doing this talk is to use maybe some nicer images, because I kind of don't want it to seem too much like a doom and gloom kind of thing, because I don't want people being depressed about this, Well, actually, could you get me a glass of water?
Sure.
So basically, what this talk's going to be on is we're going to be focusing on the bloodline of the evidence that I've looked into of where he's actually going to be coming from. But first of all, what we're going to be needing to learn to understand is that we're going to have to go back and we're going to have to look at these heads here. And we won't be focusing on the woman, because she's symbolic of a great city and that, but that'll be for another talk. But what we're going to be focusing on is the 7 heads, to do with, which represent the 7 mountains, literal mountains I would say, and also literal kings. And we're going to be looking into the meaning behind blasphemy, of why there's blasphemy written on top of on their heads in Revelations chapter 17 and Revelations 13, as well as chapter 12 as well. So we're just going to get straight into this. So at first, what we're going to do is that we're going to look at the 7 mountains here, and it's in Revelation 17 verse 9, and it says here, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth." So what we've got here is that what I've learned from Michael Heiser is that we have to interpret this as literal mountains, other than trying to think of them as kingdoms. Because sometimes they think to themselves that maybe the mountain of God was almost like a symbolic of a kingdom. So you can say that the mountain is symbolic of a literal kingdom. But we also have to understand that the angel is telling us that these seven heads are definitely represent literal mountains. So just going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and get a good idea of, from what I found anyway through my research. Excuse me. From my research, I realised that because sometimes people think that maybe it's talking about the 7 hells of Rome and that, but I thought to myself that the whole context seems to be focused on Jerusalem with the Antichrist. Just like we learned in Daniel 11 and Daniel 7, the whole context seems to be all to do with Jerusalem. So what I did not realise was, as we look on further with this, is that I actually found that you actually had the 7 hills of Jerusalem, but what I find interesting is that they're also called mountains as well. So this probably would have confused a lot of people, and they probably would never thought to look here. For example, one of the 7 hills of Jerusalem is actually called the Mount of Corruption. So we're actually going to, and just like we learned, the whole context of the Antichrist is always in the area of Jerusalem. So what we're going to do here is that I found a website that talks about this, and here's the different mountains, and they don't look like mountains, but for some reason the ancient way of thinking seems to be slightly different from the way we think, so this probably would have confused a lot of people. So the first one is Mount of Olives, number 2 Mount Scopus, number 3 Mount of Corruption, number 4 Mount Ophel, number 5 the original Mount Zion, and number 6 the new Mount Zion, and 7 the hill on which the Antonia fortress was built. So we're just going to look at a map here, and these are just where they are here, and that. But they also call them hills as well, just like we learned in the Old Testament. And it's 7 hills. Now, the next thing we're going to be looking into now, that I find to be quite interesting, is these 7 kings here. And we're just going to read here in Revelations 17 verse 10, and it says, And there are 7 kings, so this is to do with the heads, the 7 heads. 5 are fallen, so, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. This is so talking about, of course, the Antichrist. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space, which is the 3.5 years warned against the saints. So what I've found is that to actually understand where the ancestry of the Antichrist comes from, we actually have to look back at what king was still alive while John was writing Revelations. So this particular one here, so there's ones when John was writing, these ones had already been and gone, but this particular one is the one that we actually need to look at to give us a clue as to where the Antichrist of his father's fathers, that that these are his ancestors. So the term used fathers, that's just it's just the Israelite way of thinking when it comes to talking about the ancestors of the Israelites. What I found here is that I actually find that it was actually Herod Agrippa II. He was born in 27 CE and died in 93 AD. He was a great-grandson of Herod I the Great, and John would have still been alive at the time that this particular king was actually still alive. And of course, you find that their capital, because the next thing that we do is that we actually look at the Herodian dynasty of rulers, and we actually find that their capital is way back to Jerusalem. So there's an image of Jerusalem there. So I'm pretty convinced that this, because what we're going to do is that we're going to start counting how many kings there was back then. And this will help us to get an idea of what's going on. So there are 6 in total. I could only count 6, which makes sense because we've got 6 in our past, but of course there was one still alive while John was alive. Find out there was 6 in total. And we're just going to look into the names of these kings. I'll just read them out anyway. These are the names of them. So basically, the fallen 5 kings are, so we'll just go back to this one here, is King Herod the Great, so this is 39 to 4 BC. Number 2 is Herod Antipas. Mark 6 tells us that he is a king. And number 3, King Herod of Chalcis. He was on till 49 AD. Yeah, that's right. I've got mixed up there. And then, of course, we have King Herod Agrippa the first, 49 to 44 CE, and number 5, King Tigranes, which is 6 to 12 CE of Armenia. So those ones were in the past, which means that the 6th king was Herod Agrippa II, and he was ruling from 50 AD to 93 AD. So that means that John, between 50 AD and 93 AD, John must have been writing Revelation. So he might have been, I don't know, he probably pretty old anyway, possibly. Don't know how old, of course, but I find that very interesting. So and of course what we learn is that the other rulers, when I was trying to count to see if there was any more kings, I couldn't find them having the title of king. So they were just kind of normal rulers, without the title of king. So we only got 6 in total. Now what we're going to do is that we're going to look into the Herodian dynasty, the Jewish connections, and Judaism. So this is from a source that I found here, and it says here, and Herod was only half Jewish. His father was an Idumean from south of Judea, who had converted to Judaism. So what I find, this will help us to understand why it uses the term God of his fathers, which is a type of term that used for those that had converted to Judaism. And this is what's actually helping me this is what's convincing me that I have to be looking in the right place here. And the next thing we have to also remember is that Herod was actually expected. He wasn't like a normal, typical pagan king where they can just kind of do whatever they want. Herod was meant to be following the ways of God. He was meant to, he was basically meant to be doing, like the Ten Commandments and things like that, but of course he blasphemed. He started to move away from God altogether, which was, of course, was not good back then. So what we find here is that we're actually going to start to look at the character of these Herodian kings who become blasphemous. So that's what we're going to be looking into here. So it says here in Revelation 13, verse 1, and it says, "And upon the heads the name of blasphemy," the 7 heads, blasphemy. The heads, remember, are the Herodian kings who blaspheme God and his laws. They almost follow the Roman type of lifestyle. And this is one of the reasons why we have why a lot of them are wondering why the Antichrist seems to be connected to Rome in some way, as we learned in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. So we're just going to look into this. So we're going to look at the meaning of blasphemy to help us get a good idea of what's going on here. And what this means is that it's, when you look into the ancient world, it basically means slow or sluggish to call something good that really is good, and it is also slow to identify what is truly bad that really is evil, and switches right for wrong, wrong for right. Yeah, and of course it calls what God disapproves of as right, and exchanges the truth of God for a lie, which is in Romans chapter 1, verse 25. So we can see this taking place in our modern society of today, where, even like the laws of the land can be very, pretty terrible, it's like you just have to put on the news and you realize that some of the things that's going on is pretty crazy, it's not good. So anyway, this is the true meaning of what it is to actually blaspheme God. And of course we learn that the Herodian dynasty kings were expected to practice Judaism, but instead they blasphemed God and his laws. So let's look at some